So in this chapter 19, it's the second part of the cardiovascular system. So we covered the properties of blood and importance of blood last week. And today we are going to study the anatomy and physiology of the heart. See, like here's a healthy heart. It's the size of your closed fist, and then it fits in the palm of your hand. It's supple and pink, not much fat in it. So this is a healthy heart. Next week, we'll study the arteries and veins, which would be the third part of the cardiovascular system. So here, why is our lecture very important? It's because cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death globally. So like this is a very interesting map. And the top disease that kills people, see both in Canada and USA, it's heart disease. So everywhere you see pink, it's heart disease. So over 17 million people die every year globally because of something going wrong with their heart, either the arteries or the pacemaker, the muscles. There are many reasons, many list of heart disease are prevalent now. And another very interesting facet is it can be prevented. That's what CDC says. It's because of our lifestyle that we have this high incidence of cardiovascular disease. By preventing high blood pressure, blood sugar, cholesterol, we can manage heart disease. So it can be prevented by behavioral factors, by reducing tobacco use and alcohol use, by eating healthy diet, by following a healthy diet and being physically active. So that's one of the biggest reasons as to why you have to understand the importance of heart and heart diseases. So we will study the location and position of the heart in the thoracic cavity. The other learning outcomes would be to study both the internal and external anatomy of the heart, all the features of the heart, all the tissue layers of the heart. So our heart is like a pump, right? It's pumping blood to every cell in your body, throughout your body. So we'll study how the physiology of that pumping action. We will study the main arteries and veins that actually feed the heart itself. And we'll trace the pathway of blood through the heart. That's very important. And we'll also study the cardiac cycle, and we'll finish off with a few common heart disorders. So in this slide, you can see circuit means it begins and ends at the same place. So here's the heart in the thoracic, in the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity. So the circuit or the blood supply that goes to the lungs is called pulmonary circuit. It carries blood to and from the lungs. So it pumps the blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. The systemic circuit, system means rest of your body, your head, your arms, your legs, your torso, that's the rest of your body. So the systemic circuit carries blood to and from to the rest of your body. So pulmonary circuit, pulmonary is another word for respiratory system. So we have the pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit. So we can see how the blood rushes to your fingertips as an artery and it comes back to the heart as a vein. The blood supply that nourishes the heart is called coronary circulation. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood to the heart. The actual exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide happens in the capillary beds. So next week, we will study arteries, veins, and capillaries. So this slide is just emphasizing the 3 important circuits. So when you say circuit, it begins and ends with the heart. So let's look at the location. So I'm here in this picture here, the location of your heart in the thoracic cavity. So between your right lung and your left lung, there is a cavity called mediastinal cavity. So right behind the sternum, above the diaphragm. So that's where the heart is located. So the heart is not, stable. It's very dynamic. It's moving constantly. So in order to reduce the friction, it is protected in its own cavity called pericardium. And there is a lubricant outside the heart in the pericardial cavity. So when it beats, there is no friction. So we'll study the same in lungs also when we study the respiratory system. So the heart is a muscle. It's a hollow muscular organ located between the lungs, behind the sternum, and it's about 250 to 300 grams. It is slightly shifted to the left. In order to accommodate for a larger right lung, it is slightly shifted to the left, about 1.5 centimeters from the mid-sagittal plane. The broad part of the heart is called as the base of the heart. The tip of the heart is called as the apex of the heart. So if you should do a cross section of the thoracic cavity, and you can see a picture here, you can see the vertebra, the spine of the vertebra, the body of the vertebra, and then you can see the esophagus that is right behind the heart. And then you can see the heart, the right lung and the left lung, and this is the mediastinal cavity. The heart is protected in the pericardium, which is the sac of connective tissue, tough fibrous connective tissue that is protecting the heart. And you can see the pericardial cavity, which is filled with pericardial fluid, so that when the heart beats, there is no friction. So it's a lubricant. And the picture in the bottom right here, it's showing the different protective layers of the heart. So pericardium is the sac. The epithelium that lines the pericardium is called as parietal pericardium. It's serous in nature. It makes the fluid. And the membrane epithelium that sticks to the heart is the visceral epicardium. It's the visceral, and that's the parietal. So here, this is a picture of all the chambers of the heart, and you can see how the right heart is like not connected to the right. They're connected, but there is no flow of blood between the right and the left part of the heart. So there are 4 chambers in the heart. The chambers on the top are called atrium. So we have the right atrium and the left atrium. Remember, in anatomy, your left is the patient's right. So just imagine that you're looking at the patient. So this is the right atrium, left atrium. These are the top chambers. And the bottom chambers are larger. They are called ventricles. We have the right and the left ventricle. The right atrium, so this is the right atrium, it's going to collect blood from the systemic circuit. And the right ventricle is going to pump this blood into your lungs where it can get oxygenated. The left atrium is going to bring in the blood from the lungs that is oxygenated. And the left ventricle, when it contracts, it's going to pump the blood to the systemic circuit. Before we proceed, I want y'all to watch this 3-minute video. It's from National Geographic, so that you can imagine, how all the structures relate to each other.
The heart pumps blood throughout the body, carrying oxygen and nutrients to every cell. It's this circulation of blood that is vital.
Professor, we're not able to watch the video.
The heart
Thank
is an
you for
organ
telling.
made up of several tough layers.
I think I have to share screen here. Give me 1 minute.
Of muscle. The pericardium is the thin layer that covers the exterior, while the endocardium lines the inside walls. The heart is divided into 4 chambers, 2 upper and 2 lower. The upper chambers, known as the atrium, receive blood coming into the heart. The lower chambers are the ventricles that pump blood out. Between each chamber are valves that open and close and help keep the blood moving. They are the tricuspid, mitral, pulmonary, and aortic valves. A pumping cycle starts when oxygen-depleted blood returns to the heart after circulating throughout the body. The blood enters through the right atrium before flowing to the right ventricle. It's then pumped to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. There, blood is rejuvenated by air that's breathed in. The oxygen-rich blood returns to the heart through the left atrium, where it goes to the left ventricle. Then, by way of the aorta artery, the fresh blood is pumped throughout the body before the process repeats itself. That process happens with every heartbeat, and it's relentless. The heart beats 100,000 times a day, 40 million times a year, and up to 3 billion times over an average lifespan. But there are conditions that can disrupt a heartbeat and that normality. They can range from myocardial infarction or a heart attack to heart disease and hypertension. In contrast, exercise and emotional excitement can also have an impact on a person's heartbeat. The various blood vessels that comprise the circulatory system are a network of veins, arteries, and capillaries that span over 60,000 miles throughout the body, and the heart is the pump at the center of it.
All right, see, that was a very good video. So you can see that the heart has 4 chambers. The atria is much smaller than the ventricles. And we saw a little bit of the anatomy in the video here. So the atria is thin-walled, and then it has a expandable cavity, not cavity, an expandable chamber. It is called auricle of the heart. And it looks like a dog's ear. Auricle means ear. So because this is a small chamber, it can increase its volume because of the right atrium. So there is a sulcus. Sulcus means a shallow groove. We've seen this in the brain. So a sulcus divides the atria from the ventricle. So it is called coronary sulcus. There is also a sulcus that divides the right and the left ventricles. It is called the anterior and the posterior interventricular sulcus. So nestled in the sulcus would be all the big arteries and veins. So in this picture, you can see the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle, and you can see the interventricular sulcus, and you can see the coronary sulcus. And you can see the posterior interventricular sulcus with the arteries in it in the posterior view. The protective tissue of your heart. So if you take a small sliver of your heart, a cross-section of your heart, this is what it looks like. So here's the pericardial sac. So the pericardial sac is made up of dense fibrous connective tissue. The inside lining is called parietal pericardium. It is the epithelium, right, which is serous in nature. It is also called mesothelium of the heart. So we know epithelium is always sitting on a basement membrane called loose areolar connective tissue here. And then we have the pericardial cavity that has the pericardial fluid. And when you come to the heart itself, the first layer is the epicardium, which is called as the visceral pericardium. Then it is the muscle layer, which is the myocardium. Myo means muscle, muscle of the heart. Cardium means heart. So we have a muscle layer with the protective connective tissue layer. And then we have the endocardium, which is the innermost lining of the heart, sitting on areolar connective tissue. So these are the different layers of the heart: the pericardium, epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. So together, they make the heart very, very protected. It's highly protected, and the muscle is nice and strong. And if you study the fascicle arrangement in the heart, the muscles of the heart, see the atrial musculature, you can see how it forms these concentric layers. So this can withstand a lot of pressure, and it makes it very durable and efficient. And you can see how the ventricular, see the ventricular musculature is like a figure 8. So the fascicle arrangement offers a lot of stability to the heart. So these are the layers of the heart, and this is the musculature or the fascicle arrangement of the heart. The cells that make the myocardium. So they are heart cells. So it is called cardiocytes or myocytes. So here in the histology of the heart slide, we also saw this in AP1 during our tissue lab. So these cells are striated. You can see the striations. They are uninucleate, and very interestingly, they are branched. The most important feature is the intercalated disc. So in this intercalated disc, you can see a lot of desmosomes anchoring the cells with each other, and something called gap junctions. So through gap junctions, the cells can exchange ions, and it can trigger the action potential much faster because of the sharing. So it's very important. So the action potentials can travel fast from cell to cell, and it can convey the force of contraction, and it can propagate the action potential quickly because of the gap junctions. So these cells are much smaller than skeletal muscle cells. They are about 10 microns in diameter and 15 microns in length. They are branched, uninucleate, striated. They are called cardiocytes. The most important feature is the intercalated disc, where there's gap junctions that can share the electrons during the sodium ions during the action potential. And because of that, the whole heart can beat in sync. So you're going to see this picture a few times, the cross-sectional anatomy of the heart, everything that's happening inside the heart. So as you'll see the same picture, and I'll keep adding more anatomical terminology. So when you do a cross-section of the heart, you can see the right atrium and the left ventricle, right and left, and then left and right atrium and ventricle. There is a septum, it's called intra-atrial septum, that will divide the two atria. The two ventricles are divided by atrioventricular septum here. There's another septum here. It's called interventricular septum, interventricular septum. Between the atria and the ventricles, there are these valves. So these valves are very important to make sure that the blood is flowing only in one direction, and there's no backflow. So you can see how they are opening down like this. So this valve is called as a tricuspid valve. See here, tricuspid valve. That means it has 3 flaps or cusps. So it's called tricuspid valve. The valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle is a bicuspid valve or mitral valve. So the valve's function is to make sure the blood flows only in one direction and that there is no backflow. In this picture, you can also see the superior vena cava, which is the vein that is bringing blood from the top half of your body and decanting in the right atrium. And this is inferior vena cava, what you're seeing in the bottom. And this, the biggest artery, the aortic arch, leaves from the left ventricle here. So this is supplying blood to the rest of your body. So let's look at more features that's happening in the atrium and ventricles. So in the right atrium, The superior vena cava is bringing blood from the head, neck, your upper arms, and your chest region. The inferior vena cava is bringing deoxygenated blood. That's why it's shown in blue. So if it's deoxygenated, it has to go to the lungs. The inferior vena cava is bringing blood from the lower trunk, the viscera, and the lower limbs. The valve between the atrium and the ventricle is called right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve. So it has two names. It has three cusps. The valves are connected by these strings. They are like tough fibrous connective tissue strings that anchor the valves to papillary muscles that come from the floor of the ventricles. These strands are called chordae tendineae. So we have the three cusps that's attached to chordae tendineae. It is attached to a nipple-shaped muscle called papillary muscle that come from the floor of the ventricle here. It is irregular here. It's called trabeculae. The muscles that are protruding in the ventricle are called trabeculae. So when the muscle contracts, so when the ventricle contracts and the muscle contracts, they pull the chordae tendineae and helps with the prolapsing of the AV valves, so that all the blood will be pushed only through the pulmonary valve. See, this is called pulmonary valve. It's called pulmonary valve because it's going to your lungs. It will divide into the left and the right pulmonary arteries here. So all the important features you have to know here: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, the AV valve or the tricuspid valve, chordae tendineae that is attached to the cusps, the papillary muscles that is arising from the trabeculae of the ventricles. In the left atrium, the left and right pulmonary vein is going to bring in the oxygenated blood. So from the left atrium, the blood will flow through to the left ventricle. And this valve here has two cusps. It's also called mitral valve. It's an AV valve, but here it's called mitral valve or even bicuspid valve. So the blood from the lungs, the oxygenated blood, will pool in the left atrium. And when this valve opens, it comes to the left ventricle. And when the left ventricle contracts, it will push the blood up to the aorta. So it's high pressure here, aorta, and then that will take it to the systemic circuit. So here in this picture, you can see the four valves. When the AV valves are open, the pulmonary valves and the aortic valve will be closed, and vice versa. The valves are kept in place by the cardiac skeleton. It is a dense connective tissue. So this gives structure and it gives the shape of the heart. It keeps the shape of the heart. So this is the cardiac skeleton. They are bands of dense connective tissue called annulus. They're called annulus. So it's providing structure and support to the heart, and it is going to isolate or divide the atrium from the ventricles. The take-home point in this picture is when the AV valve opens, the aortic and the pulmonary valve will close. And when the aortic and the pulmonary valve open, the AV valves will close. So if you study the musculature of the heart, you can see that the right ventricle, the muscle is thin, whereas the left ventricle, the muscle is very thick. So in a cross section, you can see that there's a shape difference and a thickness difference. The reason being the right ventricle has to pump blood only to the lungs. It's very close by, so the pressure is very low. So that's the reason. Whereas the left heart, the left ventricle has to develop enough pressure to pump the blood to the systemic circuit. So because the pressure, it has to accommodate a high pressure, the thickness of the muscle is much thicker here. So here's the dilated and here's during contraction. You can see the shape is also different. So this picture is a very important picture. This is talking about the pathway of blood through the heart. So deoxygenated blood enters the heart. The arriving is at the right atrium. So the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava are going to bring deoxygenated blood to the right atrium. So this will fill up. And then after it gets a command from the pacemaker, an action potential will be triggered. And then when the ventricle contracts, it will decant into the ventricle through the tricuspid valve. And then when the ventricle contracts, it will push it into the lungs for aeration. So number 4, blood flows to the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk. And then it goes to the lungs for being, it gets oxygenated. It comes back to the heart through the left and right pulmonary vein to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it will cross the bicuspid valve and it will fill up the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, it will push the blood to the aorta. So the aorta is as big as a garden hose. So very high pressure blood here. And then this is called ascending aorta, and then descending aorta. It will be supplying oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. Spend some time in this picture and master this slide. There's also a help video posted there. So now coming to the blood supply of the heart itself. The heart is living tissue. We know that without blood and oxygen, the tissue will die. So the same with the heart also. So the coronary artery, so you can see it's originating from the aorta here, and it's very high blood pressure. So the main artery here is the right coronary artery that supplies blood to the right atrium, parts of the ventricles, the nodes, and marginal arteries. See, these are marginal arteries. So in other words, there's a very rich supply of blood to the heart. So we have the right coronary artery here and the left coronary artery here. And the artery that goes around the heart is called circumflex artery. So the left artery will supply the left ventricle and the atrium and the septum. So here in this animation here, you can see the atherosclerosis that people talk about. You know, it's connected with lifestyle. So when it forms, it's mostly cholesterol, the plaque. So when the plaque forms in arteries, the blood flow is obstructed. So this can lead to, when there's a blockage in any of these main arteries, and then when there's a blockage, the tissue will start to die off. So this is when they do the bypass, you know, like double bypass, triple bypass and all that. When they put a stent, and the stent will have a little balloon in it, and they'll blow up the balloon and they will open up the artery, thereby establishing blood supply to the heart. So this is called as a heart attack. And this plaque is mainly because of fats and cholesterol. There are many TED Talks and YouTube videos that talk about how you can manage all these plaques and even reverse this, but through lifestyle and exercise. So this is the most important part of the heart. How does the heart beat? What is the electricity or the conducting system of the heart? So when you say heartbeat, it is a single contraction of the heart. And it is, the heartbeat is very synchronized. The entire heart will contract in series. First, the atria will contract, followed by the ventricles. So there are two types of cells in the heart. The cells that generate the electric current is called as the conducting system of the heart. It generates and conducts electric current. The cells that respond to it are the contracting cells of your heart. Heart has autorhythmicity. That means it can beat. See, like we've seen videos of a heart beating even outside of the body. That is called autorhythmicity. It does not need commands from either the brain or hormones, it can develop its own electric current. So there is a natural pacemaker in the heart. So in the right atrial wall, there is a node called SA node. So these are special cells that is going to trigger the cardiac cycle. It will produce an action potential. The action potential will develop in the SA node. It will go to the AV bundle here. So that is in the interventricular, the atrium and ventricle, it's on the junction there. It will shoot down the septum through bundle branches, and it will radiate throughout the myocardium by Purkinje fibers. So this is called bundle of His. So we have SA node sending the message, or it's triggering the action potential. Then it will come to the AV node. There'll be a pause here, making sure the atrium is contracting. Then it will shoot down the bundle of His and then up the Purkinje fibers. So here you can see how the heart is contracting in sync. First, the atria contract. When they contract, they'll push the blood to the ventricles, and then the ventricles contract, pushing it either to the lungs or the systemic circuit. And this electricity that is passing through the heart can be picked up with the ECG. So here, each wave of the electrocardiogram responds to one of the action potential features here in the heart. So let's see what's happening, how the action potential is generated. So the SA node is the heart's pacemaker. It can generate about 80 to 100 action potentials per minute. And it's going to transfer the action potential to the AV node. That in turn will send down the action potential down the bundle of His and up by the Purkinje fibers. So SA node is creating the action potential. The stimulus is spreading across the atrial valve and it reaches the AV node. There is a short delay in the AV node because it's giving enough time for the atrium to contract. Then the impulse travels down the interventricular septum. It's called bundle of His. And then it radiates up the heart through the Purkinje fibers. So when that happens, the ventricles will contract. Any kind of abnormal heart activity is called arrhythmia. When your heart beats slowly, it's called bradycardia, and fast is called tachycardia. So there are two main phases in the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is the period between the start of one heartbeat and the beginning of next. When you say systole, it refers to the contraction of the heart chambers. And diastole is relaxation of the heart chambers. So this picture here, it's very important. It's a little different from the action potential that we studied in AP1. So in the sinoatrial SA node, so here if you study this picture, the resting membrane potential is negative 90 millivolts. So this is a graph that is charting the electricity change over time. It's all in milliseconds. It's happening very fast. So a normal cell that is bathed in sodium and calcium outside the cell, and then there's more potassium inside the cell. So the membrane potential is negative 90. So because of rapid depolarization, sodium ions will rush into the cell and the cell becomes more and more positive. So negative 75 would be threshold, and then it becomes 0 and it becomes a plus 30. So this rapid depolarization, it says rapid depolarization, refers to one wave in the ECG here. Then in order to maintain the depolarization, calcium will enter the cell. So this is to make sure that the action potential spreads to the ventricles also. So that is the plateau phase, calcium entry into the cell. So after the message is gone and the muscle is contracted, it has to repolarize, and repolarization will happen when sodium leaves the cell. And it'll usually overshoot a little bit, the repolarization. So the same electrical activity that's happening in the cells of the heart is represented as the electrocardiogram. The P wave is atrial depolarization. PQ wave is the time from atrial to ventricular when the action potential moves to the ventricles. The QRS complex is ventricular depolarization. And then the T wave refers to the ventricular repolarization, ventricular repolarization. So the electricity of the heart can be picked up in an electrocardiogram. And there are specialists who study this. You know, the electrocardiogram can reflect any kind of heart disease or arrhythmias especially. So this is a summary diagram as to what's happening during the cardiac cycle from the beginning of one heartbeat to the next heartbeat. So to repeat one more time, the action potential develops in the SA node and atrial systole begins. The atrial contraction will force blood into the relaxed ventricles. So the AV valves will open. So when this relaxes, this will contract. So when the atrium relaxes, the ventricles will contract, and the ventricle contracts, the atria will relax. So that's the cardiac cycle that's written out here. Atrial systole, and then followed by atrial diastole, followed by ventricular systole, followed by ventricular diastole. So this is the cardiac cycle, and it is under the control of the pacemaker cells, SA node, AV node. Coming to the sounds, you know, heart is one organ that makes all these interesting sounds. So a stethoscope can pick up the sounds that your heart makes, the lup-dup sound. So the lup is also called S1 sound, is produced by the AV valves closing. And the dup is produced by the semilunar valves, which would be the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve closing. And there's also S3 and S4. They are very soft sounds when the blood flows into the ventricles and atrial contraction, which is usually not picked up. Some numbers, if you're a cardiologist, this is what you would be interested in. It's the cardiodynamics. How much blood is your heart pumping out? Cardiac output is the volume of blood that is pumped by your heart per minute. So it is a multiplication, or it's a function of your heart rate and stroke volume. The heart rate is the number of heartbeats per minute times the stroke volume. So that would be the cardiac output. Like athletes, they train to increase the cardiac output. How is your heart rate regulated? We touched on this when we studied the autonomic nervous system. So you can see the vagus nerve innervating the heart. So the nervous system controls the cardiovascular center from the medulla of your brain. When under control of the sympathetic nervous system, your heart rate increases. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system will calm your heart down. It will decrease the heart rate. In the walls of the heart, there are special receptors called baroreceptors that is always going to monitor your blood pressure and blood volume so that your body can respond to it. There are hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and also your thyroid hormones can speed up your heart. It can make your heart beat faster. The heart rate is also dependent on your fitness level, your age, and gender. So you can see how the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system is controlling the rhythm of your heart. So this is the last slide. That's just like a brief overview of some of the most common heart diseases. So arrhythmia refers to irregular heartbeats, and this is how the picture looks like. A normal ECG looks like this, and anytime you have tachycardia or bradycardia, you can see how the ECG looks different. So this ECG is a very good diagnostic tool. Coronary heart disease refers to any kind of obstruction to the blood flow to your heart. When the heart muscle is damaged, it's called cardiomyopathy. It can also get infected. It's called pericarditis infection. The heart attack, myocardial infarction. The valves can cannot function properly sometimes. So there's a lot of valve disorders also. And when the cardiac output is affected, it's called as a heart failure. So there are many, these are common heart disorders. So what did we learn today? So we learned the anatomy and physiology of the heart. We studied all the types of tissue that make the heart. We studied the internal anatomy of the heart. We studied the valves, chordae tendineae, trabeculae. We saw how the valves function. We saw how the action potential is generated in the pacemaker cells. We saw the electric current that flows through the heart that is picked up in an electrocardiogram. We saw the sequential activity of the heart in the cardiac cycle. We briefly touched on the cardiac output and the stroke volume of the heart.